stepfather was in the Korean and Vietnamese wars. I lived in LA, where an entire community was turned into a war zone from those returning from war, destroyed. 20,000 people were killed in 20 years that no one would talk about. The driving of hate against beautiful cultures and beautiful people, dead friends across the world, and refugees that remain hungry ghosts for the loss of their home and culture. And then there's the planet, where war is the greatest industrial cost to climate change. So I give my life to ending war. What seemed so simple was that we need to cooperate with China, not war. We need it for the planet and for people. It just seems so sane. But nothing else that anyone was saying was making any sense to life or caring about what really gives us life. So when I entered this relationship to war in China, knowing very little about China, it's been this 4 years of steep learning curve. And early on, I met a Wall Street banker who made a film about how China took the last 100 million people who were still in poverty out. Now that's after they took another 900 million out of poverty. When in the 60s, when I was a kid, they used to say, eat everything on your plate because a kid in China is starving. China was the 5th poorest country in the world. And that's in my lifetime. I'm only 70. So like in my lifetime, a lot of people have been taken out of poverty. So this film that he made was shown once and then censored. So that's another piece of smoke. Why are we censoring something that we could all learn from? Because I don't know about you, what city you live in, but in mine, it is full of people who are unhoused and are really dealing with rough circumstances. So what makes them so afraid? Why do they want to censor this movie? It's also ridiculous to watch how almost every article in mainstream media takes a dig at China, which basically makes the writer stupid, which I find very sad. It also makes you stupid. I call the propaganda the weeds. They are planted by the State Department to catch you in and drown out your concerns, which are valid, by tying you up in issues that are not serving anyone, as they give you nothing to do to engage with them to make the situation better, which is a good clue when you see weeds. The propaganda is to deflect you from what is really going on and use you and your heart for hate and war. We have an excellent tool for you at the website called Debunking the Discourse, created by a member of the Army who was taught Mandarin and did the distortion for his job. He's created this tool to help you, and I'm sure Megan will put it in the chat. What we do know is what happens when the US makes another country an enemy. Again, that has no relationship to the people. It's always a figurehead. It's never about the people. With China, we're talking about 1.4 billion people. The US has lost all the other wars since World War II, where millions have died, and the planet has been polluted for generations. The war on terror cost taxpayers $20 billion, and over 5 million were killed. I say murdered. The choice between propaganda and friendship with China will be costs we can't imagine. Just like what you see daily in Palestine, like I can't even think. And you're going to hear more later to really help you try to conceptualize how freaking dangerous this is. Palestine is, maybe 3 million people. A war in China is 1.4 billion people. Remember that. And I want to also say, when we go to war in a country, your mind has been narrowed to its Putin. You have been dehumanized, as wars are on people. But the war machine wants you to forget that. Our China is Not Our Enemy campaign works to center this US war in China with a pivot to what would learning from each other, cooperating for everyone on the planet together, and friendship look like. They want to take our imaginations and make war the only answer, and you know better. So I'm excited to introduce you to this awesome panel of speakers who will bring you into a deeper relationship with this circle of smoke. And I hope we can whet your appetite to learn more about China, so you can want to also affect your friends and stop the coming fire. Our first speaker is one of my heroes, Michael Wong. He also knows very well the costs of war. He is the vice president of the San Francisco chapter of Veterans for Peace and just stepped down from national leadership at Vets for Peace. He's been an anti-war activist since the Vietnam era and is currently working to raise awareness and organize against the dangers of a new Cold War with China. Mike.
Thank you, Jodie. Let me give a little bit of history of this new Cold War II on China. After the Cold War, after Cold War I, the US developed a plan to dominate the world after the fall of the Soviet Union. It was what was called the Project for a New American Century. And that later on it developed into the Wolfowitz Doctrine. It was a US plan to dominate the world. What they did was they started off by breaking most of the stronger Middle East countries with different wars, either invasions or proxy wars that we started or had some hand in. We also expanded NATO to the border of Russia, eventually resulting in the Ukraine war that you see today. And then Obama came and introduced what he called the Asian pivot. He moved 60% of our naval force to Asia to surround China. He built up our bases surrounding China. He developed, under him, his administration developed concepts of war, such as air-sea battle, blinding, disabling, attacking China, full spectrum dominance, these kinds of theories to try to plan how they were going to defeat China in a war and break China. Why were they trying to break China? Because China was making a peaceful economic rise, and they were fearful that if China became economically strong enough, they could then resist American domination. And if attacked militarily, they could build up their defenses to be strong enough to actually defend themselves. This was something that was intolerable to the American plan to dominate the world. So this became one of the major trends in US strategy for world domination. Multiple Pentagon studies, plans, strategies have declared that China is an existential threat to the United States, which it's not. It's on the other side of the world. It's never threatened the United States. We have it surrounded by bases and allies and fleets, planes, submarines. We're running carrier battle groups up and down their coasts. They're not doing any of that to us. They don't have any bases anywhere near us. They have one base, Djibouti, which is used to support their fleet off the coast of Somalia, which is part of the plan by the United States to patrol the coast of Somalia with other nations, including China, including different Western nations, including other allied nations, against piracy off the coast of Somalia. That's all it is. There are other ports that China has built with other nations that are civilian ports. The military, the US military claims they are military ports, but they are not. Obama and the people who followed him, Trump and now Biden, they've developed allies with right-wing governments in Japan, South Korea, Taiwan Island. They've managed to now bully the Philippines into re-accepting bases that had formerly been canceled. They've developed a Link 16 system so that all of these different countries can communicate with each other just like NATO forces can. They've actually brought NATO into the Asian area to participate in military exercises off China's coast with other American allies. And they're using propaganda, like claiming that there is a genocide going on in Xinjiang against the Uyghurs. The truth is, there's no genocide going on. The UN has had teams of investigators in there, and they've issued reports. You can go online and look for them that say there's no genocide happening. Different Muslim nations have sent investigative teams. They say there's no genocide happening. Over 200 million tourists have been all over Xinjiang in 2023. Nobody's reported genocide. There's no big influx of refugees across the border from Xinjiang into the several Muslim nations that border Xinjiang, unlike Europe, where thousands of refugees are fleeing from America's Middle East war. That's not happening in Xinjiang. So there's a lot of propaganda that's going on. Hillary Clinton once said, "I don't want my grandchildren to live in a world dominated by the Chinese." This is a fear that the US elite has because they believe in a paradigm called the zero-sum game, which is either you are the dominator or you are the victim. And they look back to Western history where, for thousands of years, going back through history, different small nations in Europe have fought each other. And then the, colonial period where different powers fought each other, World War I, World War II. But that's Western history. That's not world history. China's history, which goes back 5,000 years, is one of securing their borders and then trading with the rest of the world through the ancient Silk Roads, rather than going around the world trying to conquer people, fighting constant wars to try to keep people subjugated. They've never done that because they recognize that that's a fool's errand. That's a form of Russian roulette, essentially international Russian roulette. China has survived intact as a civilization for 5,000 years. During those 5,000 years, numerous Western civilizations have come and gone. The Greeks, the Romans, the different colonial powers, and the United States is facing the same pattern. A strong nation in the West rises, it dominates other nations, and then it eventually overextends itself, exhausts itself, and collapses. We're in those final stages now. And when their empire collapses, either they can return to being a normal country, which is just fine, or in some cases they disappear completely. So that's the background and the history that I want to present. And I know other speakers will talk about other aspects, so I'll leave that to them. Thank you. You're muted, Jodie.
Thank you, Mike. Thank you for bringing us into relationship with China. And thank you for your courage too, because as we know, telling the truth about China can be very costly. Like the New York Times can decide to attack you with a lot of lies. So I also want to remind everyone that, in this buzzsaw world where what happened today? Oh, the Columbia Law Review got closed down because they suggested that there was a genocide in Palestine. So you can't tell the truth, and you get, if you tell the truth, they want to hurt you. And so I just want to remind you about our speakers. They speak from their hearts and with courage, because we all need to be speaking up right now. So our next speaker is Haig Hovanes, who is a peace activist with a professional background in information technology. He's the co-chair of the Peace Action Committee of the Green Party, and he's written and presented on a variety of defense-related technology issues. He holds an MBA from New York University, and if you want to read more once you're finished, he's whet your appetite. He has a great piece out called War with China, and we can put that in the chat. Haig.
Thanks, Jodie. I'm going to share my screen. Try to make this bigger. This should suffice. Okay, I'm going to address the economic conflict that is unfolding with China. And I'll try to cover as much as I can in the time allotted, but it's a topic that could fill a whole day's worth of discussion. I'm going to talk briefly about US-China relations, explain how economic relations are turning hostile, talk about the intensification of it, of economic warfare, and then address what I consider to be dangerous consequences. There's been a turbulent history with China. It started out actually with warfare right after World War II, Mao's victory in the revolution, expelling the Kuomintang to Taiwan, and then fighting against China in Korea. After that, there were hard feelings, economic sanctions, and arms embargo. But in the 70s, Nixon and Kissinger decided that they wanted to drive a wedge between Russia and China, so they opened diplomatic contacts, and China, recovering from all of its wartime travails, began growing and developing economically and opening up. And the US at that time welcomed those developments. The growth continued all under authoritarian regimes, but the US didn't seem to mind too much as long as there was money to be made by corporations offshoring and trading. Tiananmen Square, the suppression of that uprising, hardened relations again. There were temporary sanctions, interruption of military ties, but then economic activity returned, engagement grew significantly. And in the 2000s, it really exploded. There was a tremendous movement of investment and capital into China from the US and other parts of the world. Today, politicians say America hollowed out its industry, but it was very profitable to the corporations to do that. And then, more recently, hostility has manifested itself in economic and military terms. This chart is revealing in terms of explaining why things are changing. This shows the projected GDP of the two countries, the US in blue and China in red. And you can see around the year 2010, observers could project that sooner or later, the Chinese economy was likely to overtake the US economy. By some measures, it already has done so, although this chart indicates it's still a year or two away. It's hard to compare economic figures across countries, but the trends were clear. And this, I believe, is the cause of the renewed hostility, because the governing circles of the US perceived the threat of a new superpower. It was a threat to US hegemony. And of course, it became a rationale for massive continued US defense expenditures. It's a lot easier to justify a military buildup against a nation the size of China than it is against, say, Serbia. So we got, in 2011, Obama making a speech about a turn toward Asia. He didn't say a turn against China, but observers figured that out for themselves. And from that point on, all we've heard about are the US military talking about deterring China, preparing for war with China. China is consistently referred to as an adversary, which is today's newspeak for an enemy. And things are deteriorating. So what kind of economic conflict symptoms do we see? Tariffs are increasing, and in some cases recently markedly. If you look at this chart, I hope you can make it out. The Biden declared tariff on electric cars is now 100%. You can't buy a $30,000 excellent Chinese electric car in the US because it's going to cost you $60,000, half of which will be paid to the government. It's gross protectionism, and it's aimed at an important sector of China's economy. 50% on semiconductor imports, 50% on solar cells. So much for the green agenda. If it comes from China, it's going to be restrained. So it's a clear indication that the tariff war is underway and it's targeting China. If you were trying to protect an industry, you'd be restricting other nations, but these are clearly aimed straight at the Chinese economy. There are some outright import bans. A few years ago, the US decided that Huawei's excellent 5G cell phone equipment was a threat to our security. This map graphic shows what nations have agreed with the US to ban Huawei 5G equipment. You'll notice that countries like Brazil and Saudi Arabia don't perceive a security threat from the Chinese listening into everyone's phone calls. So it's clearly a pretext to harm China's competitiveness in this field. And more recently, Congress has decided that TikTok, a Chinese-owned company, should not be controlled by China, because again, that is a threat to America's security. There might be items crossing your phone on TikTok that aren't compatible with state propaganda. Now there are export bans too. Most of you probably haven't seen a picture of a UV lithography installation. This is a $250 million machine that produces state-of-the-art microcircuits. The power of a computer chip is a function of how densely the circuitry can be packaged. And this type of machine is produced by only 2 or 3 companies in the world. ASML is one of them. And you need it if you're going to make state-of-the-art, super powerful microprocessors. And this is what AI applications rely on, racks and racks of these tremendously powerful chips. So this export ban, I don't mention it on this slide, but there's also a ban on US technical personnel working in support of Chinese microprocessor development. They're subject to sanctions. So these are very significant bans. There's no other way to interpret these as deliberate inflicting of damage on the Chinese economy, restraining the Chinese economy, completely contrary to the norms of globalization, which were so ardently promoted just a decade ago. What are the consequences of this escalating economic warfare? Inflation is likely because tariffs are a cost borne by all the nations where consumers have to pay them. Recession is likely if there's market instability because of disruptions of trade. Supply chain disruptions impact corporations that can't source things from China or can't get materials that they need. Potentially, if there's retaliation, there's a loss of Chinese and other Asian markets. Recently, the Chinese instructed government officials not to use Apple products or Google products because they say that might be a security threat. But it's a kind of tit for tat. And if it escalates, markets get closed off. There's the possibility of a loss of dollar's reserve currency status. If China starts dumping all of its treasury securities, if it increasingly does business in its own currency and rubles and other currencies, there's less demand for dollars, which means the purchasing power of the dollar diminishes. And lastly, and most ominously, if economic warfare becomes quite acute, you get a cause of war. Let me just dwell on one.
Hi, do you have 1 more minute?
Okay. Let me show you quickly what a supply chain impact looks like. This is Apple's supply chain. You'll see what goes into an iPhone mostly comes from China or the vicinity. 20% of Apple's revenue comes from China. If this gets disrupted, it's a major hit to Apple. Why do I mention Apple? Because Apple's the biggest company in the United States. By market capitalization, it dwarfs all the companies in the defense sector put together. The non-defense corporations are 10 times bigger than the defense sector. Unfortunately, these are the companies that control congressional military funding. They have the most fabulous return on investment. For a couple $100 million, they reap $500 billion in revenue. So this is what we're looking at. This conflict is going to make winners and losers. No matter how battered the US economy is, the steady pumping of money into the military is going to do a good turn for these companies. And the non-defense companies are going to get hammered. And what puzzles me is how the CEOs of these companies are just sleepwalking into this potential disaster. The casus belli. In 1941, the US seized Japanese assets and prohibited the shipment of oil to Japan. Economic warfare measures. A few months later, Japan attacks Pearl Harbor. The Japanese decided that they couldn't extend their empire with this kind of economic sanction, and they decided to fight their way out. It was a bad decision.
Finish your thoughts, Heike.
So on the note of casus belli, I'm going to hand over to my colleague, Ryan Swan, who will be introduced by Jodie. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Haig. That was so interesting. And I just want to say the chat would love access to your slides. So I wonder, Chris, if we could open up the chat, because I'm getting notes in every direction that it's not open between each other or the participants or the speakers. If that could be open, that would be awesome. When that's open, maybe Haig, you could tell folks how to access your slides, or you could put in your article, because like you whet everyone's appetite very effectively. And you've also, really taught us that the war's already happening and the people are already the losers, as is the planet. Thank you for that. So our next speaker is Ryan Swan, a member of Green Party Peace Actions, and a Gerda Henkel doctoral scholar in the Special Program for Security, Society, and the State. His doctoral research at the University of Bonn focuses on strategic effects of emerging military technologies on deterrence dynamics. He holds an MPhil in International Relations and Politics from Trinity Hall, Cambridge, and a JD from the UCLA Law School. And Haig and Ryan wrote an article about the arms race that gets escalated when US focuses their enemy-making apparatus, so the war economy has a new cash cow. And I'm hoping we can get that posted for you also to be able to reference after this. Ryan.
Okay, thank you so much, Jodie. Can everybody hear me okay?
We can hear you, thank you.
Okay, excellent. Very preliminarily, one quick correction. I'm actually now at the University of Tübingen, and also the views that I'm going to be expressing today, essentially this presentation represents my own views and not those of the Institute, Bonn International Center for Conflict Studies, or the University of Tübingen. Okay, so with that, liebe Grüße aus Deutschland, warm welcome from Germany to everybody. I am going to be building on Haig's presentation, essentially addressing taking the next step and looking at what would a war between China and the United States actually, what costs would it entail, how might it play out? So next slide, please, Haig. Okay, so what I'm going to do today is just very briefly, because 10 minutes is not a long, not a substantial amount of time, and I can hear the clock ticking, so I'm going to go very quickly here through this first part, possible conflict scenarios, just going to touch upon a couple of possible pathways to conflict. Then I'm going to actually go through what these consequences of war might look like for the United States based on recent war game simulation data. And then if I have time at the end, I'll touch upon one possible remedy. Unlikely though it be. Next slide, please. Okay, so possible conflict scenarios. There are a whole onslaught of them, a whole slew of them, unfortunately. So I'm just going to touch on three of the major ones. The first one is East China Sea, the Senkaku Diaoyu Islands. The islands were originally controlled by Japan they were claimed by China since the 14th century, then conquered effectively by Japan in 1895, first Sino-Japanese War, then were relinquished to essentially custodialship by the United States in 1945, and then handed back over by the United States to Japan in 1972 in accordance with the Okinawa Reversion Agreement. The islands, let me say this. So there have been increasing disputes between China and the United States and China and Japan over the islands, maritime incursions by the Chinese into Japanese claimed territorial waters. And in 2013, China unilaterally declared an air defense identification zone, which encompassed the islands, much to Japan's chagrin. China subsequently proceeded to carry out maritime, again, operations, patrol ships, also flyovers into airspace that is disputed, as well as maritime space that's disputed. Why is this significant? It's possible a conflict could break out between China and Japan over the islands. Michael O'Hanlon, director of the foreign policy program at Brookings, recently wrote a book on this, the Senkaku Paradox, basically how this conflict between China and Japan could play out. This is significant because since 1960, the United States and Japan have had a collective security agreement. So this conflict between China and Japan has the potential to draw the United States in. Next slide, please. South China Sea, this has been actually receiving more attention, at least in the Western media, as I've been tracking it, than developments in the East China Sea. There's a whole array of possible pathways I could talk about. I'm just going to address a couple of them. One is between China, again, and the Philippines, with which the United States also, since 1951, has a collective security agreement. So any military conflict breaks out between China and the Philippines has the potential, again, to draw the United States in. Scarborough Shoal was effectively seized by China in 2012, causing much consternation between the two nations, again, namely China and the Philippines. Also, the second Thomas Shoal, since 2013, there have been repeated incidents between the Chinese Coast Guard and the Philippine fishing vessels, one of which this was the most recent event, or one of the most recent events from March of this year, 2024, clash between Chinese Coast Guard and a Philippine fishing vessel. Also, there have been a number of incidents, far too many for me to enumerate here, incidents of near clashes, encounters between Chinese and US aircraft, or US and Chinese military naval vessels. Accident could precipitate a conflict. It could rapidly escalate to potential military conflict. Next slide, please. And here's, of course, the most prominent one, Taiwan. Here they've been mounting tensions since at least 2012. Michael and Heike already referenced the pivot to Asia, policy initiated by the Obama administration in 2013. Beginning tensions, President Xi came to power in 2012 and promptly delivered the now renowned Great Rejuvenation speech. It's become eminently clear, expressly clear, that reunification with Taiwan is an integral component of China's so-called Great Rejuvenation policy, to be completed by 2049. Okay, so since 2022, August of 2022, and the visit by then House Speaker Nancy Pelosi, with a congressional delegation to Taipei, China responded with a new level of, large-scale military exercises featuring a new level of intensity, including the firing of live missiles over Taiwan directly. These military exercises tension have only intensified into 2023, when then Taiwanese President Tsai Ing-wen visited the United States, New York, and California. And this has precipitated, these mounting tensions precipitated a number of calls for predictions that the United States and China will become engaged in a war with Taiwan in the near future. This picture is of General Michael Minahan, the commander of the Air Mobility Command, and he authored a memorandum that came to light at the beginning of 2023, in which he now famously predicted that the United States and China would be at war over Taiwan in 2025. And the memorandum instructs the personnel under his command to take steps accordingly. Next slide, please.
Excuse me, Ryan, you have 2 minutes.
Okay, so I'll go through this very quickly then. Possible consequences. So here, fortunately, we don't have any real-world data to draw from. So what I've done is I've assessed the 2 most recent open source wargame simulations, one by the Center for Strategic and International Studies from 2022, and one from the Center for New American Security from 2022. And then I look at scratch at the surface of some classified wargame simulations by RAND and the Department of Defense. If I have time, I'll quickly touch on those. Next slide, please. So the CSIS simulation ran 24 iterations of possible conflict scenarios between China and the United States over Taiwan, set in roughly contemporary times. And it looks at both the consequences for China and the United States. I'm just going to touch on those for the United States here. And I basically looked through the 24 simulations and have drawn the aggregate results from all of those simulations. Basically, common features are, we see this throughout the 24 simulations, devastating attacks on remote US basing, particularly those on Japan and Guam, with massive loss of personnel and assets there. Massive impairment of the US C4ISR capability, sensor grid, that's command, control, communications, computers, intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance. Debilitating. Without the C4ISR capabilities, the United States war machine is unable to operate effectively. It suffers significant damage as a result of both kinetic and non-kinetic strikes. Loss of tremendous numbers of aircraft, 200 to 500, though most simulations were more in the direction of 500. Loss of at least 2 aircraft carriers, and substantial number of other major surface vessels, destroyers, and so on. Significant casualties, more in the first week in most simulations than the total number of combined casualties from the Afghanistan and Iraq wars over the past 20 years.
Finish your thoughts,
Yes.
Ryan.
Okay, next slide, please. Okay, the CNAS simulation essentially just focuses on, and I'll close with this, escalation. So in the CSIS simulation, there was no possibility of nuclear weapons use. Here, CNAS ran just one simulation, set in 2027, and here, all weapon systems are on the table. And what the simulation essentially showed, and I can go into more detail in the Q&A to the extent there's interest, is that there was rapid, uncontrollable escalation to the nuclear level. The simulation ended with the use of nuclear weapons and featured the United States striking the Chinese mainland and China striking the territorial United States. So basically, and I'll conclude with this remark, conflict between the United States and China would be catastrophic for the United States militarily. This is not including the economic and other related costs that Hype touched upon. So it has to be avoided at all consequences. I don't have time to go into my possible remedy, but again, if the Q&A, if we have time, I'm happy to touch upon this. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Ryan. Yes, very dark, very, very dark. And just a reminder to everyone that the US has way more nuclear weapons than China. China has a no first use policy and doesn't keep their nuclear weapons armed. But every look at this does, lead there, given what Ryan was laying out. And so, Ryan, I think Megan will fill in with some what we can do. So our last speaker is Megan Russell, CODEPINK's China is Not Our Enemy campaign coordinator. Megan graduated from the London School of Economics with a master's degree in conflict studies. And she spent 1 year studying in Shanghai and over 8 years studying Chinese Mandarin. Her research focuses on the intersection between US-China affairs, peace building, and international development. We are very lucky to have her leading this campaign at CODEPINK. Make sure to follow her. She will make you smarter as her articles unpack and offer real information. And Chris, if there's anything you can do to open up the chat so folks can be communicating and we can be posting some things, that would be awesome. Take it away, Megan.
Thank you so much, Jodie, and thank you everyone for your discussion of these important issues. Today, I want to talk a bit about advocating against war with China and what areas we've been focusing a lot of our attention on when it comes to US policy on China in the Asia-Pacific region and also at home here in the US. So one of the most contentious issues is undoubtedly the US's hypermilitarization of the Asia-Pacific, the buildup of troops, bases, and weapons in Japan, the Philippines, Guam, Korea, and all around the region in the name of containing China. And this is a problem for a number of reasons, not just because studies show militarization is known to increase the likelihood of war, but also because, and I stress this, that it is clear that US policy in the region is already harmful to the local populations and also to the natural environments where they live. There are many cases of damage to protected reefs, chemical spillovers infecting the land, human rights violations, ignoring the demands of local communities. In Guam, for example, despite widespread local opposition and even censure from the US Environmental Protection Agency, thousands of military personnel have been transferred to the small island, and live fire training ranges and other military installations have been built over sites of spiritual and cultural significance to the native inhabitants, including areas with protective wildlife sanctuaries for endangered species, burial grounds, limestone forests, and on and on. It's just the more you learn about it, the worse it gets. So it's horrible, but our government continues to cite the necessity of this over the containment of China, even despite the fact that this outdated concept of deterrence falls very flat in the face of what the US is doing with antagonistic war games and creating mini trilateral alliances, like we've spoken a bit about today. So, it's provocation and it's preparation, not preventing, not deterring, and it's hurting people and it's destroying the planet, not protecting it. And so second, one of the reasons the US is getting away with these things, why there seems to be such a public consensus over this need to contain China, is because of the media's demonizing portrayal of China and Chinese people. You will be hard pressed to find a single positive thing in mainstream Western media about China. And criticism is typical, it's normal for any government, but the media's portrayal of China is entirely negative, lacking nuance, complexity, honesty, and quite a bit is contrived. So it's clearly agendaed, which is also typical, but our media needs to be a tool to keep our politicians in check, not to go along with whatever senseless war they're cooking up for this decade. And this is harmful on many levels, here and abroad. Asian American hate crime, for one, has been steadily rising, and these narratives have also hurt local Asian-owned businesses. It builds paranoia, which leads to bad policy decisions and terrible legislation like sending billions more to militarizing the Asia Pacific, or attempting to ban TikTok, which is a platform that millions of Americans use to bring a voice to these issues and other extremely important issues. I've seen a lot of articles that attempt to dystopianize news articles in China. For example, the New York Times took a positive Chinese article about how a community officer helped two neighbors settle a feud and turned it into a story of mass surveillance. And nobody can read the sources cited because they're all in Chinese. So it's strange and paranoia filled and overwhelmingly clear that our government and its media extensions have done nothing but create division and fear in their attempt to generate public support for the push for war against China. So information warfare, it's always the first step. And this is an area we're able to combat by acknowledging and celebrating China's success. For example, bringing 8 million people out of poverty, achieving unprecedented economic infrastructural growth, creating the first city where all public transportation is electric. There's so many things China's done, and you won't find it anywhere in Western media outlets. So it's our jobs as individuals and peace activists to separate ourselves from narratives that are born predominantly out of xenophobia and hate, and learn on our own terms what truth we want to stand for. So third, this narrative of competition with China and winning against China, it clings to political discourse. There's no winning when actions cause large-scale economic hardship for any country, for any people. Our Congress men and women and policy experts like Pottinger and Gallagher repeatedly recite their love for these Cold War era deterrence strategies, using militarism to maintain the hegemonic status of the US, saying the US shouldn't manage competition with China, but win it. And the reality is that China is deeply, deeply enmeshed in the global economy, and decoupling is just as unrealistic as it is dangerous. Attempting to do so would lead to global economic losses that could take years and years to recover from, and the IMF had put out studies on this already. And this is something that John Kerry has repeatedly expressed, the US climate envoy, as well as some others in the White House, like Janet Yellen. Not to mention, as Hay was talking about earlier, the US has put extremely high tariffs on solar panels and electric cars coming from China, making it nearly impossible for the average American citizen to buy. And it's important to protect American workers, but there won't be American workers if we destroy the planet, right? So in the end, we won't successfully defeat the climate crisis working in opposition to China. We need cooperation and diplomacy if we ever want to stand a chance against this issue. And so fourth, the fact that war is even a little bit of a consideration is mind-boggling when it's clear that the consequences would be devastating on literally every existing level. Like even if a conflict was able to avoid going nuclear, even if it was mild and short, the damage to the Chinese economy would be immense. According to Rand, there would be 20 to 35% shrinkage at best, and this could plunge millions of people into poverty. And the damage would echo around the world. I mean, China is home to 1.4 billion people. The US is something like 300 million. So the consequences on a human level would be staggering. And the fact that our government doesn't care about the 1.4 billion people living in China speaks volumes. And also local populations in the Asia Pacific would undoubtedly face the brunt of the violence, which is one of the reasons they're so adamant about the US leaving. And that's not even considering the nuclear potential or the environmental damage or the reverberating effects of war, which always lead to widespread health issues, poverty, mass displacement, starvation, and death. And, this carries through generations. This lasts a long time. So overall, US foreign policy, when it comes to China, it's anachronistic, it's Machiavellian, it's dangerous, it's hurting people and the planet in the here and now, not just some potential future. And it's fueled by the US's imperial nature and this desire to maintain its hegemonic status. It's not a matter of security, it's not a matter of protection. So this is a multi-level problem, and it requires multi-level actions. The first, and if you're present here today, you're probably in a better spot than most, is to learn and educate yourself about the realities of cold or hot war and why the US is pushing for one. We must continue advocating against hypermilitarization of the Asia Pacific and work in defense of the local communities and of the natural environment. We have to disarm the discourse to recognize the demonization of China in the media and the push for this creation of an enemy, this creation of evil that our government claims they must defend us against, and build a new perspective of China with just greater depth, greater understanding of its 5,000 long years of history and the way its unique philosophies and stories and history play into its vision of the world and itself in the world. And lastly, we need to spread the message that war is the true enemy, not China, and that conflict on any level would be catastrophic and unacceptable. Thank you.
Yay, Megan, yes. War is the enemy, not China. Please, leave with that today. War is the enemy, not China. So we have a very few minutes left, like 2. I wonder if there's any of the speakers who have clarifying questions for another speaker, since I can't seem to access the chat. Megan.
I would love to hear more about Ryan's talk about nuclear escalation, and I guess just the thoughts you weren't able to finish at the end of your presentation.
Jodie, we have 2 announcements before we go into.
Okay, so you're saying no time. Oh, did you want Don Fitz to come up now?
Don Fitz and Rita Maniotis. They have 2 separate announcements.
Okay, so we're going to hear from the Green Party. Don Fitz, let's hear what you have to say. Are you here?
Heidi, I'm not sure how these chats are working, but he said he needed access to have a voice. And I don't know what that means.
I'm looking for him on the list.
And then Rita Maniotis has been here. And this is an announcement about the RNC and DNC protests.
Well, we're going to be at the RNC and DNC, so we're looking forward to disrupting the status quo and the warmongering parties, both Democratic and Republican.
Awesome.
Yeah, I should point out it's not a hard limit. We can go past past half hour.
Except if you have a plane to catch.
Oh,
So
I apologize.
while we're waiting for Dawn, I just want to thank all of our speakers and their passion for peace and the understanding of this landscape. And thank you for listening, because as peace activists, it's up to us to live from kindness and compassion and the understanding that war is the enemy, as Megan says. It is us that need to cultivate a peace economy, each of us. And, you know, the Green Party, the earth and the people need us. But we've heard a lot. Megan has an amazing comic strip that makes it very clear. I hope we will be able to get that into the chat for you to see, or we'll send it after. But pass on what makes this simple so we can keep people out of the weeds that drain life and intelligence. You know, war is a word that means to confuse. So we hope this has helped clarify for you, make it more simple, and not let your heart and mind be weaponized for war, because friends don't let friends be used for war. And we hope you will create your own relationship with this information as time goes on, because there is a war going on and we need to stop it. Do we have Dawn on yet? I'm just talking away.
Can't find him on the list. Chris, if you could ask him to try to connect again. He's not showing as an attendee.
And I guess to Tony, who's asked quite a few questions in the chat, you know, it is American capitalists that took the jobs of the workers over to China. China did not take those jobs. American capitalists took those jobs to China. So it's not China's fault that they're there. It's American capitalists' fault. And this war is not about jobs. It's about hegemony. And it's very clearly about hegemony, because there's cooperating with China would help the American worker. It will help the people of America. It will help the people of the world. That a war between the United States and China will be a war that affects everyone. And so, no, it's not about jobs. And I just, you know, the one thing we have to remember is those jobs went to China because the American capitalists wanted it to go to China. Still waiting for Dawn. So Richard asked a question about China's communist ideology in its international relations. I'm just looking up, except could we just, while we're waiting for Dawn, could we go back to Ryan taking 2 minutes on Megan's question while we're waiting?
Sure.
Thank you.
Okay, I'll be very concise. Thank you, Megan, for the question. Basically, with regard to the CNAS simulation, first I should note that both CSIS and CNAS are as mainstream a US think tank as you're going to find. CNAS being Michelle Flournoy, for those of you who know who she is, think tank she founded in 2005. So we're talking about very pro US think tanks that are funded by and large by MIC funding. So the assumptions that are built into these simulations are very skewed in favor of the United States. So these results that I enumerated in the talk are under the most favorable conditions, to the point that it's not really realistic. What I didn't get to touch on was the classified simulations, again, which I've only been able to scratch the surface through comments by those involved, and also partially through former colleagues of mine at Lawrence Livermore National Laboratories. These paint a very grim picture from what we can see. Also, rapid escalation. Very quickly, the United States being forced to strike the Chinese mainland in order to prevent widespread destruction of its forward deployed forces, which in turn prompts China to strike Guam, and then in the CNAS simulation, also in the classified simulations, Hawaii. And then from there, once that happens, essentially the escalation up the ladder to the nuclear level follows very promptly. The CNAS simulation ends with the use of tactical nuclear weapons, but once those are employed, the threshold has been cleared and all bets are off. So I'll just close by echoing Megan's point. War is everybody's enemy, and it's a war between the United States and China cannot be won by any party. The entire world would be the loser.
Thank you very much. I see Mike has his hand up.
Yes, I just wanted to speak a little bit on Taiwan because I think that's probably the most dangerous flashpoint. First of all, I agree with what Ryan said about how dangerous the escalation is, and that it could very well escalate to the nuclear level, and it could very well end the world. Specifically regarding Taiwan, Taiwan has been part of China since the last Qing dynasty, going back, I forget how many hundreds of years, long before the United States even existed. And then during the colonial period, it was taken from China by force, and eventually Japan had it for about 50 years. And then after World War II, it was given back to China. There was a civil war between the Chinese communists and the Chinese nationalists. The communists won, the nationalists retreated to Taiwan. And during Cold War I, much of Cold War I was spent with the nationalists saying, we're going to go back and retake the mainland. And then Nixon went to China, made peace with Mao through the Shanghai communiques and other agreements. It was agreed that there was only one China. Taiwan was a part of China. But the question was, what government would rule? And that was left to the Chinese. The United States explicitly said that that's an issue to be settled between the Chinese themselves. China was recognized at the UN with Taiwan as part of it. The government on Taiwan, its official title is the Republic of China. Its constitution lays claim to all of China. So from the viewpoint of the Chinese, this is an internal civil war. And just as the United States would never give up Hawaii or Texas or another state, China is going to be unwilling to give up Taiwan in the same way. But the United States is pushing very hard because there's the dominant element of the hawks in Washington right now want a war with China because they think they can break China and also break all the other Asian countries which are rising economically as well by having them fight each other. They know that Taiwan is a place where China cannot back down, so they've been increasing arms. Our agreement after Nixon was that we would not continue to escalate our arms shipments to Taiwan, that we would have no official contact. Nancy Pelosi and other officials have in fact gone there, including a delegation just recently. And we've got Green Berets training people even on Kinmen Island, which is right offshore, rifle distance almost from the mainland. So the United States is escalating pressure, and they're trying to push China into a war because they know this is a sensitive spot. So I think this is particularly dangerous. This may be the flashpoint that happens that if a war is to occur. The other dangerous flashpoint is Korea, which is a whole nother huge topic that I won't go into, but I think people have a general idea of what's going on in Korea.
Okay, thank you so much, Mike. That was super important. I'm wondering, do we have our friends that we're going to talk about the RNC and DNC? Dawn is here, not here? So I think we should leave it here. There was a lot delivered. I hope that we can follow up with emails to you, with the chat and more links. I encourage everyone to study and learn. I mean, I hope we can follow up with the articles that have been written, you know, by Ryan and Haig. Megan's written some amazing articles, as has Mike, and they've done many other webinars. The point here is not to be used by the propaganda. The point is that the enemy is war, and for people on the planet, let us not be tools of war, but tools for peace. Thank you so much for joining us today and for caring about these issues. And yes, please join all of us at the DNC and RNC so that we can stop both war parties from continuing to go to war. And maybe Dawn, if you want to post something in the chat for everyone, if the people can save the chat, or Barbara, because I have no technology capacity on this webinar and I can't help in any other way. So if Dawn and Barbara could just post in the chat how people can join the Green Party at the DNC and RNC, and Green and Pink will be happy to see each other because we will be there too. Are we pro-Putin? We're pro-peace. We're pro-humans. We're pro-human beings and don't want to be distracted by the finger pointing that takes us away from humanizing all these people that the arrows get pointed at that die and that the earth is destroyed. So thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you, Ryan and Megan and Mike and Haig, and thank you, Chris, for holding us all together and being our technology. Onward to peace, everyone. Thank you.
Good night. Chris, I'm going to keep the webinar open for a few more minutes just to make sure that if Don is present, he can put something in the chat. Unless he's got an alias, I did not see him on the list. I traversed.
He's on Barbara Chichirio's, and I've been emailing you, which is Zoom 4, correct? I was not ever the technician, so I don't. There's Barbara and Dawn right there. But see, they don't have, what they're saying is they don't have access because they're not a panelist.
Okay, I just got voice access.
I
Can you
can make him the panelist too. I'm really
Thank you,
sorry.
Michael.
I kept looking for Don's name, and that was the difficulty.
But I emailed you Chichirio. This is,
Yeah.
I sent a message, but I couldn't never tell if you were getting them.
No, I had pretty much a full screen Zoom window. There's just so many modes of communication now. It's easy to overlook the one that's critical.
Yeah.
At any rate,
Ike, sorry, I came in a little bit. I missed the whole half-an-hour introduction at the beginning.
Yeah.
It's a
I
technical
think going
difficulty.
forward, we're going to have a dress rehearsal for the next one of these we do, because we have to have a smoother process.
Okay, so there's still 21 attendees.
Can you hear me at this point?
Yes,
Yes,
we can.
Don. Yeah.
Oh, okay, well, 21 people and not a whole lot more. Yeah, what we've done at all the webinars that I've handled is have everybody who's going to have a comment as a panelist. And that way everybody is on from the very beginning, and you don't have to wait until the webinar itself to put somebody on. I did want to tell people that on July the 3rd, day before July the 4th, Wednesday, the Green Party will be having a webinar titled Jill Stein Challenging Empire. And we will be dealing with a lot of the issues that were sort of hinted at tonight, which is how do we avoid war? You know, what do we do to avoid war? And we believe it's not going to be done by the Democrats or Republicans, that it has to be done by other forces. And so Jill Stein is going to join, and we're going to have people from the East Coast, one person from the East Coast, one person from the West, one person from the South and one person from the Midwest, talking about what issues they think are important in the campaign, and especially how they have been kept off the ballot and what sort of political harassment people have who try to bring up peace, including Jill Stein, who was attacked by the police when she was in St. Louis on April the 27th. So I think we're pretty much now down to not very many people left. Is that right?
Got about 20 people.
Oh, okay.
22.
Oh, 20. Okay, well, that's pretty good. And so that's basically what I wanted to say. Look for the announcement for the July 3rd webinar. Join Jill Stein. And if you have a question, about the Green Party, about what she would like to, a concrete action she would like to take for peace, we believe it's deeper than just the bad decisions. We believe that it is part of capitalism. It's that imperial expansion has characterized all phases of capitalism. So I would just urge people to join us on July the 3rd. That's it.
Thanks, Don.
Okay.
Okay, then, I'm going to end the webinar, and we will work on the recording. Should be available in a week or two. So thanks to all attendees. Thanks, Chris. And we will move on to our next project. Good night, all.